The cop harassed a homeless black man on the street, but when he saw his military medals. In the heart of downtown Millbrook, a mid-sized city grappling with its history of racial tension and economic disparity, lived Marcus Johnson. At 45, Marcus cut a striking figure despite his circumstances, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that held both pain and resilience. His military bearing was evident even as he navigated the streets with a prosthetic leg, a stark reminder of his sacrifice for his country. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, earning multiple commendations for bravery. But the transition back to civilian life had been far from smooth. Struggling with PTSD and the challenges of his physical disability, Marcus had found it increasingly difficult to hold down a job or maintain stable housing. Now, he was one of the many homeless veterans who called Millbrook streets home. Officer Brian Hawkins patrolled those same streets with a chip on his shoulder and a quick temper. At 32, he was a poster child for the old guard of policing, brash, authoritarian, and deeply set in his ways. His impressive physique and neatly pressed uniform commanded compliance, if not respect, from most of Millbrook's residents. But beneath the surface simmered a toxic mix of prejudice and resentment, fueled by years of unchecked biases and a stubborn refusal to adapt to changing times. Millbrook itself was a city in transition. Once a thriving industrial center, it had been hit hard by economic downturns and the opioid crisis. The downtown area, where Marcus spent most of his time, was a stark juxtaposition of trendy new businesses catering to young professionals and boarded-up storefronts that served as a reminder of harder times. As summer settled over the city, bringing with it long, warm evenings and the scent of food from street vendors, tensions were simmering just below the surface. The recent appointment of the city's first black police chief had been met with resistance from some quarters, including officers like Hawkins who saw it as a threat to the status quo. Unbeknownst to the residents of Millbrook, a local journalist named Sarah Chen had been quietly investigating the treatment of homeless veterans in the city. Her research had led her to suspect systemic issues within both the police department and the local VA hospital. As she delved deeper into her investigation, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the stories of veterans like Marcus, whose experiences painted a troubling picture of a system failing those who had sacrificed so much for their country. As Marcus prepared for another day of survival on the streets, and Officer Hawkins began his patrol with growing resentment, neither could have predicted the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold, a moment that would shake Millbrook to its core and force a reckoning long overdue. The day that would change everything in Millbrook dawned bright and clear, a perfect summer morning that gave no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Marcus Johnson woke early, as he always did, the habits of his military service still ingrained despite years on the streets. He carefully folded his worn sleeping bag and stowed it in his backpack, wincing slightly as he adjusted his prosthetic leg. As Marcus made his way through the awakening city, he nodded greetings to other members of Millbrook's homeless community. There was a camaraderie among them, a shared understanding of the daily struggles they faced. Marcus's status as a veteran earned him additional respect, and he often found himself in the role of protector and mediator for those even more vulnerable than himself. Officer Brian Hawkins, meanwhile, was nearing the end of his night shift, his mood sour from a series of what he perceived as disrespectful interactions with local teenagers. As he drove through the downtown area, his eyes narrowed at the sight of homeless individuals beginning to stir, emerging from alleyways and makeshift shelters. Hawkins pulled his patrol car to a stop near a popular coffee shop, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster as he exited the vehicle. "All right, time to move along," he barked. Approaching a group of homeless people gathered near the shop's entrance. "You're bad for business. Find somewhere else to be." The group began to disperse, used to this kind of treatment. But Marcus, who had been helping an elderly woman with her cart of belongings, stood his ground. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we're not causing any trouble. We have as much right to be here as anyone else." Something in Marcus's tone, the quiet authority in his voice, seemed to infuriate Hawkins. He strode towards Marcus, his face flushing with anger. "I said move along, you bum. Don't make me tell you again." Marcus straightened to his full height, his military bearing evident. "I'm not a bum, sir. I'm a veteran of this country, and I deserve to be treated with respect." Hawkins sneered, his eyes flicking to Marcus's prosthetic leg. "Veteran? Sure. Probably some sob story you cooked up to get more handouts. Now move, before I make you move." The confrontation was drawing attention. Passers-by slowed to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Among them was Sarah Chen, the journalist, who had been on her way to conduct an interview for her investigation. She began filming, her reporter's instincts telling her this was important. Hawkins, noticing the growing crowd and feeling his authority challenged, decided to make an example of Marcus. He roughly grabbed Marcus's arm, attempting to force him to move. "That's it. You're coming with me for disturbing the peace." Marcus, caught off guard by the sudden aggression, lost his balance. His prosthetic leg twisted awkwardly, and he fell hard to the sidewalk. The impact sent a shock of pain through his body, and for a moment, the world around him blurred as memories of the explosion that had taken his leg flooded back. The crowd gasped. Sarah Chen pushed forward, her camera still rolling. "Officer, that man is clearly a veteran. What are you doing?" Hawkins, realizing he might have overstepped but too proud to back down, reached for his handcuffs. "Stay back, all of you. This is police business." Marcus, still on the ground, looked up at Hawkins. In that moment, all the pain, frustration, and injustice he had experienced since returning from war seemed to crystallize. With a voice filled with quiet dignity and barely contained anger, he spoke the words that would soon echo across Millbrook and beyond. "I served America, lost a leg, and you treat me worse than a dog." The weight of those words seemed to hang in the air. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the soft whir of phone cameras capturing the moment. Hawkins, for the first time, looked uncertain, the reality of what he had done beginning to sink in. But before the situation could escalate further, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Officer Hawkins." Chief Yvonne Carter, Millbrook's new police chief, had arrived on the scene, alerted by the commotion. Her presence seemed to diffuse the immediate tension, but as she surveyed the scene, Marcus on the ground, Hawkins standing over him, the crowd of witnesses with their phones out, she knew this incident was far from over. As Chief Carter began to take control of the situation, helping Marcus to his feet and ordering Hawkins to stand down, the inciting incident had occurred. In those few moments of confrontation between a homeless veteran and a prejudiced police officer, the fuse had been lit on a powder keg of issues that had long simmered beneath Millbrook's surface. The repercussions would be far-reaching, challenging the city's institutions, its residents, and its very identity in ways no one could have predicted. In the tense aftermath of the confrontation between Marcus and Officer Hawkins, a series of revelations began to unfold, forcing the residents of Millbrook to confront uncomfortable truths about their community and its treatment of veterans and minorities. Sarah Chen, the journalist who had captured the incident on video, quickly realized she had stumbled upon a story much bigger than her original investigation. As she began to dig deeper, interviewing witnesses and reviewing her footage, a disturbing pattern emerged. Marcus's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a systemic issue of police harassment towards homeless individuals, particularly veterans and people of color. Chen's research led her to uncover a trail of similar complaints that had been systematically downplayed or buried by the police department. She found evidence of a culture that prioritized cleaning up the streets over addressing the root causes of homelessness and providing support to vulnerable populations. Perhaps the most shocking discovery came when Chen obtained internal memos from the local VA hospital. These documents revealed a pattern of neglect and mismanagement that had left many veterans, like Marcus, without adequate support for their physical and mental health needs. The very system designed to help veterans was, in many cases, exacerbating their struggles. As news of the incident spread through social media and local news outlets, more Millbrook residents began to come forward with their own stories. Veterans shared accounts of bureaucratic nightmares at the VA, of being turned away from shelters, a feeling abandoned by the country they had served. Homeless individuals recounted frequent harassment by police, of being moved along from public spaces, of feeling dehumanized and invisible. For Chief Yvonne Carter, each new piece of information confirmed what she had suspected but hoped wasn't true, that the problems within the Millbrook Police Department ran deep and would require more than just disciplinary action against a few bad apples to address. The most profound revelation, however, came from an unexpected source. As Officer Hawkins was being placed on administrative leave, he broke down during his interview with Internal Affairs. He revealed that his own father, a Vietnam veteran, had struggled with PTSD and homelessness before taking his own life. Hawkins's aggression towards homeless veterans, it seemed, stemmed from a complex web of unresolved grief, shame, and misdirected anger. This revelation added a layer of complexity to the narrative. It didn't excuse Hawkins's actions, but it highlighted the far-reaching and often hidden impacts of war and inadequate veteran support on families and communities. As Marcus recovered from the physical and emotional trauma of the incident, he found himself at the center of a growing movement. His words, "I served America, lost a leg, and you treat me worse than a dog," had become a rallying cry for those demanding change. The simple dignity and power of his statement had cut through the noise, forcing people to confront the stark reality of how veterans were being treated. As the sun set on what had become a pivotal day in Millbrook's history, the revelations unearthed were just the beginning. The true depth of the problem and the challenge of addressing it was only starting to come to light. The discoveries made in the wake of the confrontation had torn away the veil of complacency that had long shrouded Millbrook's approach to veterans' issues and police conduct. It was now clear that the incident between Marcus and Officer Hawkins was not an isolated event, but a symptom of much larger systemic issues that would require comprehensive reform to address. As Chief Carter stood in her office, reviewing the mounting evidence of long-standing problems within her department and the broader community, she knew that Millbrook stood at a crossroads. The path ahead would be challenging, but the revelations of this day had made one thing clear. Change was not just necessary, it was inevitable. In the days following the incident, Marcus Johnson found himself at a crossroads. The confrontation with Officer Hawkins had thrust him into the spotlight, making him a reluctant symbol of the struggles faced by homeless veterans and victims of police misconduct. As he sat in a small room at the local VA hospital, where he had been admitted for observation after the incident, he contemplated his next move. The easy path would be to retreat, to use this moment of attention to secure some temporary aid for himself and then fade back into the anonymity of the streets. After all, he had spent years trying to avoid conflict and attention, focusing solely on day-to-day survival. No one would blame him for choosing to avoid the messy, potentially dangerous work of activism and systemic change. But as Marcus reviewed the outpouring of support he had received, the messages from fellow veterans, the offers of help from local organizations, the words of encouragement from strangers who had seen the video, he knew he couldn't walk away. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the other veterans sleeping rough on Millbrook streets, all the individuals facing discrimination and harassment, all the people the system had failed. After a long night of reflection, Marcus made his decision. He would use his newfound platform to push for comprehensive reform in how Millbrook treated its homeless population, especially veterans. He would become an advocate for change, leveraging his military background and personal experience to bridge the gap between the homeless community, law enforcement, and city officials. The consequences of his decision were immediate and far-reaching. When Marcus announced his intentions in an interview with Sarah Chen, it sent shockwaves through the city. Many praised his courage and commitment, seeing him as a champion for change. Others, particularly those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, saw him as a threat. Within the police department, reactions were mixed. Some officers, particularly younger ones and those from minority backgrounds, saw Marcus as an ally in their own struggles against the department's entrenched culture. Others viewed him with suspicion and hostility, seeing his actions as a betrayal of law enforcement and a threat to their way of operating. Marcus's decision also had personal consequences. His face was splashed across local news outlets, making him a recognized figure in the community. He began receiving messages of support from people he had served with, but also faced backlash from those who accused him of seeking attention or exaggerating his struggles. The stress took a toll on his health. Marcus found himself struggling with increased PTSD symptoms, the constant attention and pressure triggering memories of his time in combat. His physical health, already compromised by years on the streets, was further strained by the demands of his new role. Despite these challenges, Marcus threw himself into the work. He began by establishing a coalition of homeless veterans, social workers, and sympathetic city officials to develop a comprehensive plan for addressing homelessness and improving veteran services in Millbrook. His years of military service proved invaluable as he navigated the complex bureaucracies of city government and the VA system. One of the most significant consequences of Marcus's decision was the ripple effect it had beyond Millbrook. His story, that of a decorated veteran forced into homelessness and then galvanized into activism by police misconduct, captured the national imagination. Soon, he was being invited to speak at veterans' rights conferences, to testify before state legislatures, and to share his experiences with police reform committees across the country. This increased visibility brought both opportunities and challenges. Marcus found himself in a position to influence policy at a level he had never anticipated, but it also made him a target for those who opposed reform. Conservative media outlets began running pieces questioning his military record and attempting to discredit his story. Within Millbrook, the consequences of Marcus's decision played out in complex ways. As the reform efforts progressed and more instances of misconduct came to light, the city found itself divided. There were protests calling for immediate changes in police procedures and increased funding for homeless services, countered by rallies in support of law enforcement and against what some saw as the enabling of homelessness. Marcus's decision also had unexpected personal consequences. As he worked closely with city officials, social workers, and even reformed-minded police officers, he found himself forming deep bonds. He became a mentor to younger veterans struggling with civilian life, a respected voice in community meetings, and a bridge between groups that had long been at odds. Perhaps the most profound consequence of Marcus's decision came in the form of a late-night visit from Officer Hawkins's wife. Tearful and conflicted, she revealed that her husband had been struggling with undiagnosed PTSD related to his father's suicide. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to Marcus's understanding of the situation and reinforced his commitment to addressing the root causes of both homelessness and police misconduct. As months passed and the reform efforts deepened, Marcus often reflected on the consequences of his decision. The work was harder than anything he had done since his military service. The stakes higher, the opposition more fierce. There were days when the weight of it all seemed almost too much to bear. But then he would receive a letter from a veteran who had found housing and support because of the new programs he had helped implement, or see a positive interaction between a police officer and a homeless individual, or witness a moment of genuine understanding between former adversaries. In these moments, Marcus knew that despite the high personal cost, his decision had been the right one. The consequences of Marcus Johnson's choice to stand and fight rippled out far beyond him, far beyond Millbrook. He had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not just one city's approach to homelessness and policing, but spark a national conversation about how America treats its veterans and its most vulnerable citizens. As he steeled himself for the battles yet to come, Marcus knew that the full consequences of his decision were still unfolding and would continue to shape the fight for justice and dignity long after his part in it was done. While Marcus Johnson's campaign for reform took center stage, a secondary plot was unfolding within the Millbrook Police Department, centered around Officer Brian Hawkins and the newly appointed Chief, Yvonne Carter. Chief Carter, the first black woman to lead the department, had arrived in Millbrook with a mandate for change. She had been aware of the tensions within the force and the community, but had underestimated the depth of the problems. The incident with Marcus had forced her to confront the reality of the situation head-on. As she began to investigate the department's practices, Carter uncovered a pattern of misconduct that went beyond individual officers like Hawkins. There were systemic issues in training, accountability, and community relations that had fostered an environment where harassment of vulnerable populations was tacitly accepted. Meanwhile, Brian Hawkins found himself at a crossroads. Placed on administrative leave and facing potential dismissal, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. The revelation about his father's struggles had opened old wounds, forcing him to grapple with his own unresolved trauma and biases. In a surprising turn of events, Hawkins reached out to Chief Carter, expressing a desire to make amends. Skeptical but seeing an opportunity, Carter decided to take a risk. She offered Hawkins a chance at redemption through a restorative justice program, on the condition that he undergo intensive therapy and bias training. This decision was met with resistance from both within and outside the department. Many officers saw it as a betrayal, while activists argued that Hawkins deserved harsher punishment. Carter found herself walking a tightrope, trying to balance accountability with the potential for genuine change. As Hawkins began his journey of rehabilitation, he started to see the impact of his actions in a new light. Through therapy sessions and conversations with veterans, including some of Marcus's friends, he began to understand the depth of harm he had caused. The turning point came when Hawkins, as part of his restorative justice program, volunteered at a veterans shelter. There, he encountered a homeless veteran who reminded him of his father. The experience broke through his remaining defenses, leading to a profound shift in his perspective. This secondary plot intersected with the main story when Hawkins, having made significant progress in his rehabilitation, asked to meet with Marcus to apologize in person. The meeting, facilitated by Chief Carter, was tense and emotional. Marcus, initially skeptical, found himself moved by Hawkins's genuine remorse and commitment to change. Their conversation, which touched on shared experiences of trauma and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life, became a powerful symbol of the potential for transformation and reconciliation. It added depth and nuance to the broader narrative of reform, showing that change was possible even in those who had once been part of the problem. As news of Hawkins's journey spread, it sparked debates within the community about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. Some saw it as a model for police reform, while others remained skeptical of its broader applicability. This secondary plot development added layers of complexity to the main narrative, highlighting the personal struggles behind systemic issues and the potential for individual growth to contribute to institutional change. It set the stage for a more nuanced approach to police reform, one that recognized the humanity of all involved while still holding individuals and institutions accountable for their actions. As the movement for reform in Millbrook gained momentum, the relationships between key characters underwent significant transformations, shaped by the crucible of conflict and shared purpose. As the movement for reform in Millbrook gained momentum, the relationships between key characters underwent significant transformations, shaped by the crucible of conflict and shared purpose. The relationship between Marcus Johnson and Chief Yvonne Carter evolved from one of wary distrust to a partnership based on mutual respect and a shared vision for change. Initially, Marcus saw Carter as part of the system that had failed him, while Carter viewed Marcus with a mixture of guilt and apprehension, knowing he could either be a powerful ally or a formidable opponent. Their first real conversation happened weeks after the incident, during a community forum on police reform. As Marcus spoke about his experiences, Carter was struck by his eloquence and the depth of his insights into the challenges facing both veterans and law enforcement. "You know," Carter said to Marcus after the forum, "I think we're fighting for the same thing here. We both want a safer, more just Millbrook." Marcus nodded, studying her face. "Maybe. But are you ready for what that really means? The kind of change we need isn't going to be easy or comfortable for anyone." This exchange marked the beginning of a complex but productive relationship. Carter began to seek Marcus's input on community outreach initiatives, while Marcus found in Carter an ally within the system he was trying to change. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah Chen, the journalist who had captured the initial confrontation, also deepened in unexpected ways. What began as a source-reporter dynamic evolved into a partnership and eventually a close friendship. Sarah's ongoing coverage of Marcus's activism and the broader issues of veteran homelessness and police reform brought national attention to Millbrook. In turn, Marcus's story gave Sarah's reporting a human face that resonated with readers across the country. "I never thought I'd be doing this kind of reporting," Sarah confided in Marcus one evening as they reviewed her latest article. "But your story, it's changed how I see my role as a journalist." Marcus smiled, a rare occurrence that transformed his usually serious face. "And I never thought I'd be comfortable talking to the press. Guess we're both learning new tricks." Perhaps the most surprising relationship development was between Marcus and Officer Brian Hawkins. Their journey from adversaries to cautious allies was fraught with tension and setbacks, but ultimately became a powerful example of reconciliation and growth. Their first meeting after the incident, facilitated by Chief Carter as part of Hawkins's restorative justice program, was tense and emotional. Hawkins, visibly nervous, struggled to meet Marcus's eyes as he offered his apology. "I know words aren't enough," Hawkins said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did to you, there's no excuse, but I want you to know I'm committed to changing, to being better." Marcus was silent for a long moment, studying the man who had once embodied everything he feared and resented about the system. Finally, he spoke. "You're right, words aren't enough, but they're a start. What matters now is what you do with this second chance." This meeting marked the beginning of a long and difficult process of healing and understanding between the two men. As Hawkins underwent therapy and bias training, he began to share his own struggles with Marcus, including the pain of losing his father to PTSD-related suicide. In turn, Marcus found himself opening up about his own battles with PTSD and the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life. Their shared experiences, though viewed from vastly different perspectives, became a foundation for a tentative understanding. As the months passed, Marcus and Hawkins began to work together on community outreach programs, using their story as a powerful example of the potential for change and reconciliation. The relationship between Marcus and the broader Millbrook community also underwent a profound transformation. Once invisible and often feared, Marcus became a respected figure, invited to speak at schools, churches, and community events. He formed particularly strong bonds with other homeless veterans, becoming a mentor and advocate for those still struggling on the streets. His regular visits to shelters and VA facilities became a source of hope and inspiration for many. These evolving relationships created a web of support and accountability that became crucial to the success of the reform efforts in Millbrook. They highlighted the power of human connection in overcoming systemic injustice, showing how individual relationships could become the foundation for broader social change. As these bonds deepened and expanded, they set the stage for the climactic events that would determine the future of Millbrook and potentially serve as a model for addressing veteran homelessness and police reform across the nation. The climax of Millbrook's struggle for reform came to a head on a crisp autumn day, exactly 1 year after Marcus's confrontation with Officer Hawkins. The City Council was set to vote on a comprehensive package of reforms, including increased funding for veteran services, new police training protocols, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board for the police department. The steps of City Hall were crowded with supporters and protesters, their competing chants creating a cacophony of sound. Marcus stood at the forefront, flanked by Chief Carter and Sarah Chen, surrounded by a diverse coalition of veterans, activists, and reformed-minded police officers. As the council members filed into the building, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew that this vote would determine the future of Millbrook and potentially set a precedent for cities across the nation. Inside the packed chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus, invited to speak before the vote, approached the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, others hostile, and took a deep breath. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady, "I stood on these streets, homeless and hopeless, treated as less than human by those sworn to protect and serve. Today, I stand before you not just as a veteran or an activist, but as a citizen of Millbrook, asking us all to do better. As Marcus spoke, laying out the need for change and the potential for a more just and compassionate city, the room was silent, hanging on his every word. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the chamber. A group of police union representatives and their supporters burst in, their faces contorted with anger as they shouted accusations of betrayal and threats of a police slowdown if the reforms passed. Before security could react, one of the agitators rushed towards the podium, his hand reaching into his jacket. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Chief Carter moved to intercept the man, while Officer Hawkins, who'd been standing quietly at the back of the room, positioned himself to protect Marcus. The chamber erupted into chaos. Security officers rushed to subdue the intruders, while others moved to protect the council members and civilians. Amidst the confusion, Marcus remained at the podium, his voice rising above the din as he continued to speak, refusing to be silenced. "This is exactly why we need change," he called out, his words cutting through the chaos. "This kind of fear and aggression is what we're trying to overcome. We can be better than this." As order was gradually restored, the impact of what had just occurred settled over the room. The line between those resisting change and those fighting for it had never been more starkly drawn. Mayor Thompson, who had been wavering in his support for the reform package, stood up. His voice shook slightly as he addressed the chamber. "What we have just witnessed," he said, "is the clearest evidence of why this reform is not just necessary, but urgent. We cannot wait any longer to address the issues that have divided our city for too long." With those words, he called for an immediate vote on the reform package. The council members, many still shaken by what they had witnessed, began to cast their votes. One by one, the tally grew. As the final vote was cast, a roar went up from the crowd outside, who were watching the proceedings on large screens. The reform package had passed, with a wider margin than anyone had dared to hope. Marcus, now surrounded by Chief Carter, Sarah, and other supporters, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. They had done it. The climactic confrontation had laid bare the issues he had fought so hard to expose, and Millbrook had chosen the path of progress and reconciliation. But even as celebration erupted around him, Marcus knew that this was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing struggle for justice and equality in Millbrook. In the wake of the dramatic city council vote, Millbrook found itself at the beginning of a challenging journey towards implementing the sweeping reforms that had been passed. The conflict that had begun with Marcus's confrontation with Officer Hawkins had exploded into a citywide reckoning with issues of veteran care, homelessness, and police conduct. Now, the hard work of resolving these deep-seated conflicts began in earnest. Mayor Thompson, recognizing the historic nature of the moment, established a reform implementation task force. He appointed Marcus Johnson as its co-chair alongside Chief Yvonne Carter, a move that was met with both praise and controversy. Some saw it as a bold step towards real change, while others criticized it as putting too much power in the hands of activists. Marcus, acutely aware of the challenges ahead, assembled a diverse team that included veterans, social workers, civil rights attorneys, reform-minded police officers, and community leaders. Their first task was to translate the broad strokes of the reform package into concrete, actionable policies. One of the most contentious issues was the establishment of the Civilian Oversight Board for the police department. The police union fought this tooth and nail, arguing that it would undermine officer morale and effectiveness. During a particularly heated meeting, a veteran officer stood up and confronted Marcus. "You're tying our hands," he accused. "How are we supposed to do our jobs with civilians second-guessing our every move?" Marcus, remaining calm, responded, "Our job is to serve and protect all citizens. If we're doing that properly, we should welcome oversight, not fear it. This board isn't about punishment. It's about building trust and ensuring accountability." This exchange, witnessed by the entire task force, became a turning point. It sparked a frank and often uncomfortable dialogue about the realities of policing in a diverse community. Slowly, even some of the most resistant officers began to engage with the idea that accountability could actually make their jobs easier by rebuilding community trust. Another major focus of the conflict resolution effort was addressing the complex needs of homeless veterans. Marcus brought in experts from successful programs in other cities to develop a comprehensive approach that included housing, mental health support, job training, and addiction treatment. These initiatives were often met with resistance from residents concerned about the impact on their neighborhoods. Town hall meetings became heated as Marcus and his team worked to address fears and misconceptions about homelessness and mental illness. During one such meeting, a resident stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I support our veterans," she said, "but I'm afraid for my children with all these homeless people in our parks. How can you guarantee our safety?" Marcus acknowledged her concerns, sharing his own experiences, both as a homeless veteran and as someone who had felt the sting of being feared by his own community. "I understand your fear," he said. "But the safest communities are those where everyone has a stake, where everyone is valued. By helping these veterans, we're not just changing their lives, we're strengthening our entire community." Slowly, these efforts began to bear fruit. As the first transitional housing units opened and veterans began to receive comprehensive support, success stories started to emerge. Community members who had been skeptical began to see the positive changes firsthand. However, the path to resolution was not without its setbacks. A few months into the reform process, an officer-involved shooting of a mentally ill homeless man threatened to undo much of the progress that had been made. The incident sparked protests and renewed calls for police accountability. Marcus and Chief Carter worked quickly to address the situation with transparency and compassion. Unlike in the past, the department communicated openly with the public throughout the investigation process. They held press conferences and community meetings to address concerns and share information as it became available. This approach, while not pleasing everyone, helped to prevent the kind of explosive unrest that had followed similar incidents in the past. It demonstrated the department's commitment to accountability and showed that the reforms were having a real impact on how Millbrook handled crises. As the first year of reforms drew to a close, the city underwent an external audit to assess the progress of the changes. The results were mixed but encouraging. Incidents of police misconduct had decreased significantly. The number of homeless veterans had been reduced by nearly 30%, and community satisfaction with both police and social services had improved. However, challenges remained. Some officers had chosen to leave the force rather than adapt to the new policies. The opioid crisis continued to create new homeless individuals faster than the system could help them. And there were still community members who remained deeply skeptical of the changes. Marcus, reflecting on the year's efforts at conflict resolution, realized that they had made significant strides but were still only at the beginning of a long journey. The conflicts that had been brought to light by his confrontation with Officer Hawkins were deeply rooted and would require ongoing effort and vigilance to fully resolve. As he prepared for a meeting with the Civilian Oversight Board to plan the next phase of reforms, Marcus felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The work of transforming Millbrook and healing the rifts in the community was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt possible. The attempt at conflict resolution had not provided a neat, tidy ending to the story. Instead, it had opened up new avenues for dialogue, change, and growth, a process that would continue to shape Millbrook and its approach to veterans, homelessness, and policing for years to come. The turning point for Millbrook came unexpectedly, about 18 months after Marcus's confrontation with Officer Hawkins. A national news program aired a feature story on the city's transformation, highlighting the innovative approaches to veteran homelessness and police reform. As the story gained traction, Millbrook found itself in the spotlight. Other cities began reaching out, eager to learn from their experiences. Politicians and policymakers started citing Millbrook as a model for addressing issues of homelessness and police-community relations. Mayor Thompson, recognizing the significance of this moment, called a meeting with Marcus, Chief Carter, and other key figures in the reform movement. "We've been given a unique opportunity," he began. "The spotlight is on us now. How do we leverage this to push our reforms even further and help other communities?" The discussion that followed was intense and productive. They decided to take a bold new direction. Millbrook would position itself as a learning laboratory for urban reform, offering to share its experiences and best practices with other cities across the country. Marcus proposed the creation of a Community Transformation Institute, housed within the city but operating independently, to conduct research, develop training programs, and consult with other municipalities on implementing similar reforms. "This isn't just about changing our city anymore," Marcus explained. "It's about changing how America approaches these issues on a national scale." The group unanimously agreed to the proposal. This new direction would not only help solidify the changes within Millbrook, but also extend their impact far beyond the city limits. As they left the meeting, there was a palpable sense of excitement and purpose. They had turned a corner, moving from reactive change to proactive leadership in the field of urban reform. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time Millbrook was leading the way toward a new model of community-centered, compassionate governance. Chief Carter summed up the sentiment as they walked out of City Hall. "You know, Marcus," she said, "when I first took this job, I never imagined we'd be here. But now I can't imagine doing anything else." Marcus nodded, a slight smile on his face. "Me neither, Chief. Who would have thought that a homeless vet and a cop could end up changing a whole city?" As they parted ways, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The turning point had set Millbrook on a new path, one that held the promise of not just local but national impact. The work ahead would be difficult, but the potential for meaningful, far-reaching change made it all worthwhile. As Millbrook embraced its new role as a leader in urban reform, the key players in this journey found themselves reflecting on their personal growth and the transformations they had undergone. Marcus Johnson, sitting in his new office at the Community Transformation Institute, marveled at how far he had come. From a homeless veteran struggling with PTSD to a nationally recognized expert on community reform, his journey had been both challenging and rewarding. "You know," he confided to Sarah Chen during a quiet moment, "there were times I thought about giving up, about disappearing back onto the streets. But now I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be, doing what I was meant to do." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. She too had grown significantly, from a local journalist chasing stories to a respected voice in social justice reporting. "We've all changed, Marcus. But you've inspired that change in so many of us." Officer Brian Hawkins, now a sergeant and a key figure in the department's community outreach program, had undergone a profound transformation. Through therapy, training, and his work with Marcus, he had confronted his biases and the trauma of his father's suicide. During a training session for new officers, Hawkins shared his story. "I was part of the problem," he admitted, his voice steady. "I let my pain and prejudice guide my actions, but I've learned that true strength comes from understanding, from connecting with the community we serve." Chief Yvonne Carter, reflecting on the department's journey, realized how much she too had grown. From a newly appointed chief facing resistance and skepticism to a nationally recognized leader in police reform, she had learned to balance accountability with compassion. "Millbrook has taught me that true leadership isn't about maintaining the status quo," she mused during a press conference. "It's about having the courage to change, to admit when we're wrong, and to work tirelessly to make things right." Mayor Thompson, once hesitant to rock the boat, had become a champion for progressive urban policies. He found himself mentoring other mayors, sharing Millbrook's stories of challenges and triumphs. "I used to think my job was to keep things running smoothly," he reflected. "Now I understand that sometimes you need to disrupt the system to make real progress." The growth wasn't limited to individuals. The entire Millbrook community had undergone a collective transformation. Residents who had once viewed homeless individuals with fear or disdain now actively participated in outreach programs. Young people, inspired by Marcus's story and the changes in their city, were pursuing careers in social work, community organizing, and public service. As Marcus walked through the streets of Millbrook, he could feel the difference. There was a new sense of connection, a feeling of shared purpose that had been lacking before. The parks where he had once slept rough were now vibrant community spaces, with formerly homeless veterans working alongside other residents in community gardens and art projects. Reflecting on this journey, Marcus realized that the confrontation that had seemed like the lowest point in his life had actually been the catalyst for profound positive change. It had forced everyone, himself, the police, city officials, and the community at large, to confront uncomfortable truths and to grow beyond what they had thought possible. The transformation of Millbrook was far from complete. There would always be new challenges, new biases to confront, new trust to build. But as Marcus looked toward the future, he felt a sense of hope and purpose that renewed his commitment to the work ahead. The journey had changed them all, reminding everyone involved that growth often comes from the most challenging experiences, and that with commitment and courage, even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for healing and progress. 2 years after the fateful confrontation between Marcus and Officer Hawkins, Millbrook hosted a national conference on urban reform and community policing. As Marcus took the stage to deliver the keynote address, he looked out over a sea of faces: city officials, police officers, activists, and community leaders from across the country, all eager to learn from Millbrook's experience. "Our journey began with a moment of injustice," Marcus began, his voice steady and sure. "But it has led us to a place of transformation. We've learned that true change isn't about quick fixes or pointing fingers. It's about having the courage to confront our biases, to listen to those we've ignored, and to reimagine what our communities can be." As he spoke, Marcus emphasized the key themes that had defined Millbrook's journey: the importance of empathy, the power of second chances, and the ongoing work of building trust between all members of a community. "This work is never done," he concluded. "Every day, we must choose to see the humanity in each other, to listen to each other's stories, and to work together for a justice system and a society that truly serves all its members." The applause that followed was more than just approval. It was a collective commitment to carrying these lessons forward, to continue the difficult but essential work of reform. As the conference concluded, with cities from across the nation pledging to implement Millbrook-inspired reforms, there was a sense that something truly transformative had begun. What had started as one veteran's confrontation with a prejudiced system had blossomed into a movement with the potential to reshape urban communities across America. The story of Millbrook served as a powerful reminder that change, while often born from pain and conflict, has the power to heal, unite, and inspire when embraced with courage and compassion.